My aim today is to talk to you about what I think could be described as a seismic shift in the role of the Commonwealth Government that is taking place at the moment as a result of initiatives by the Abbott Government to, in particular, hand over the powers that it currently possesses under its Principal Environmental Act, the Act with a very long title, the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, or we call it in inner circles the EPBC Act. It's proposing to hand over to the states and territories the powers under that Act to grant approvals with conditions attached for projects that could significantly impact on what the Act calls matters of national environmental significance. Now, what are these matters? They involve areas such as World Heritage Sites, Ramsar, internationally recognised and protected wetlands, endangered species and ecosystems that have been listed under this federal legislation, any nuclear-related activities in Commonwealth marine waters, and most recently also what are called water-affecting activities, specifically the extraction of coal and coal seam gas where it may have an impact on the quality of water. So until now, since 1999 when this Act was passed, and it succeeded earlier similar legislation with a different set of projects that it covered, until now the Commonwealth has exercised its environmental approval powers under this legislation. The Abbott Government has developed what it calls its one-stop shop initiative. And what it is doing, it is calling on provisions in this legislation that have essentially lain dormant since it was passed in 1999 that allow the Commonwealth to enter into what in effect are contracts. They're called in the Act bilateral agreements with each state and territory whereby that state or territory would take over and subsume the functions of the Commonwealth Government in dealing with these types of projects and deciding whether or not they should be approved. To tackle this topic, what I'm going to do is actually draw on my nearly 40 years of experience in environmental law and observing this fascinating question of what is the appropriate balance or role of the Commonwealth with respect to environmental matters. And I think some historical context is terribly important here because it is being lost at the moment in the discussions and the debate about this matter. Let me start with just two matters I think that are of historical significance to this topic. This system for the assessment and approval of major projects that might significantly impact on matters of national environmental significance, actually originated not in this country but in the United States way back in 1970. And it has been replicated and transferred to many countries around the world, including here in Australia in 1974, when the predecessor to the EPBC Act, an act, and they never give them short titles, these acts. This one was called the Environment Protection Impact of Proposals Act, and some of us used to call that the EPIP Act. Well, that legislation was adopted by the Commonwealth in 1974. Now, one of the arguments that the Commonwealth Government is presenting for the one-stop shop agenda is that its procedures under the second Act, the EPBC Act, are actually duplicating existing state processes. But the historical truth is actually the absolute reverse. It was the Commonwealth Government that first enacted legislation in the form of this EPIP Act back in 1974 to establish the first legislated environmental impact assessment process in Australia. And the states gradually came on slowly after time to build up their own processes. So the allegation that the Commonwealth is actually duplicating state functions is actually historically incorrect. In fact, it was the states who have previously followed the Commonwealth. Another little known fact that I like to just draw to people's attention is that the Commonwealth has in fact had a very long involvement in driving the development of environmental law in this country. And the example that I like to give, and I often have done it with my students, is it goes way back to 1949, when in the post-war economic boom, the Commonwealth saw the need for public housing to cater for expanding population, and it decided to give funds to the states under provisions in the Constitution that allow it to make specific grants to the states. It decided to give these funds to the states to help the development of public housing and impose the condition that the states had to introduce planning laws. That is how this country came by its planning laws, because the Commonwealth made the development of these laws a condition of its financial assistance for public housing. If you switch forward to around about 1970, you'll find that from that point onwards, there's been a steady evolution in the role of the Commonwealth in terms of environmental matters, and that the nature of that evolution has been one in which essentially the Commonwealth has pursued cooperative relationships with the states. It hasn't sought to step in and override state legislation or state functions. It's largely sought in developing its own legislation and in pursuing various policies, strategies and other types of programs to engage in dialogue with the states, whereby each jurisdiction or each level of jurisdiction would find its particular place and role in the relevant environmental matter. And so we've got examples of the national ESD strategy, we've had strategies on biodiversity, climate change and many other matters, all of them developed in a cooperative way. And when you look at the legislation that the Commonwealth has developed, it is in fact very difficult to find many examples at all of where the Commonwealth has basically just legislated and overridden equivalent legislation at the state level. So again, the wider assertion that lies behind this one-stop shop initiative of the Commonwealth, that there is a widespread duplication of functions with the states in the environment, I think is misleading. The Commonwealth has actually decided not only to engage in this particular exercise with respect to the one-stop shop, but this is part of a wider, what it calls green tape reduction initiative. And prior to the last election, the Commonwealth, the Abbott opposition at that time committed to reducing red and green tape burdens imposed on the Australian economy, and I'm quoting here, by $1 billion per year. And as part of that initiative, it is now undertaking an audit of all Commonwealth environmental legislation and regulation, and working with the states to identify what it describes as unworkable, contradictory or incompatible green tape. And it has decided to appoint as the chair of the Commission of Audit that is reviewing all of this legislation, the President of the Business Council of Australia. So this seismic shift is pulling us a long way away, ultimately, from the cooperative federalism model that has basically dominated federal-state relations in the environment space for the past 40 years. This practice of cooperative federalism has extended beyond the types of legislative arrangements I've just described into policy and political relationships. More specifically, there has since 1972 been a specialist ministerial council of environment ministers from the Commonwealth, the states and the territories, who regularly meet at least once or twice a year to again pursue collaborative approaches. That particular arrangement, which as I say dates back to 1972, was terminated in December of last year, when in the Council of Australian Governments, the Commonwealth impressed upon the other parties to the Council of Australian Governments that there was no longer a need for what is now known as the Standing Council on Environment and Water, or SKEW. And thus, for the first time in 40 years, there's no longer an intergovernmental forum in this country which is dedicated to the discussion of collaborative national approaches to environmental matters. And this is being defended in part by statements made in COAG that the Commonwealth now respects the sovereignty of the states and territories. And this is a return to the language of the early 1980s and states' rights that we heard from people like Premier Bjelke-Petersen back when the Franklin Dam case was decided. So this shift is certainly a very radical one, and the resurgence of this notion of state sovereignty, I think, is an extreme form of expression of what was previously called state rights. So how is this substantial regression in the role of the Commonwealth in environmental matters manifesting itself in practice? Before I turn to the one-stop shop and say a little bit more about that, let's just look at what else is going on alongside the one-stop shop. And this list is by no means a complete one. The Commonwealth, as many of you would be aware, is proposing the repeal of the carbon price legislation and its proposed replacement by a direct action program. It announced in February 2014 that an authority called the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Authority, or NOPSEMA, would become the sole assessor for environmental assessment of projects, offshore petroleum projects, within its jurisdiction, and that eliminated the requirement for any separate assessment and approval of such projects under the EPBC Act. The Commonwealth designated 26th of March 2014 as Repeal Day, during which day more than 1,000 redundant federal laws and 9,500 regulations were repealed, and is promising to do more in that direction. Some of those did in fact include elements of environmental law relating to things like the approval of agricultural chemicals and veterinary medicines, regulation of ozone depleting substances and synthetic greenhouse gases. The Commonwealth is reviewing the renewable energy target and has proposed the abolition of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. It has attempted to have 70,000 hectares of Tasmanian World Heritage Forest area delisted by the World Heritage Committee, although thankfully last weekend it appears that that committee in its initial draft decision is not favouring that application. The final decision comes in about a month from now in Doha. It has approved the extensive dumping of sediments on the Great Barrier Reef in connection with the expansion of port facilities at Abbott Point that will allow exploitation of the Galilee Basin coal deposits. It has abandoned the management plans that provide protection from fishing in sanctuary zones for Australia's newly established Commonwealth marine parks. It has terminated funding for the National System of Environmental Defenders Officers, a system that I was partly helped to establish way back in 1995, which has provided tremendous support to so many people in the community. In last week's budget, it also terminated what is known as GVSHO funding, a scheme that dates back to 1973 and which, with the magnificent sum of $1.3 million, has supported some 120 environmental organisations around this country. And in my own case, as a member of the board of the Conservation Council of South Australia, we're now in crisis meetings about the future of that organisation as a result of this decision. The Commonwealth has also proposed to extinguish a number of other national bodies that address environmental matters, and these include the Climate Commission, the National Water Commission, the Australian Renewable Energy Authority. It has just this week introduced legislation to repeal the Energy Efficiency, Energy Opportunities program, saying it's no longer necessary because business is very good at being energy efficient. And it's reduced funding for land care by $484 million in the federal budget, whilst allocating some $525 million to its new but untested Green Army program. That's not a bad list for the first 6 months in office, is it, when you think about it? But if I now will just briefly say a little bit more about the One-Stop Shop initiative, because that is the key point of today's session, having put it all in context. The position with this at the moment is that the Commonwealth is now moving into the stage of drafting and releasing for public comment, jurisdiction by each state and territory, these draft bilateral agreements under which its approval powers will be transferred to the states. And the first two draft agreements were released just last week for Queensland and New South Wales. In terms of the justifications for this, the two arguments that have been put forward, particularly by the industry partners who are supporting this Commonwealth initiative, and I speak specifically of the resources industries, the mining and oil and gas industries, are the ones around excessive duplication of functions and also excessive cost for industry from having the Commonwealth also involved alongside the states in this field of environmental assessment. I think the duplication argument, as I've already suggested, is a furphy, and I don't believe that in practice it has any weight. Certainly in relation to excessive costs and delays also, I'd note that some of the arguments put forward by the Business Council of Australia back in April of 2012, when it first submitted to COAG the need for this type of measure, have been found by an independent assessment of those estimated costs to be spurious and greatly exaggerated. Also, the level of the costs that are genuinely incurred by industry in complying with the EPBC Act usually represent only a small proportion of the overall project development costs for most major resource projects. And when there have been delays arising in getting environmental approvals for such projects, often this has been the result of state rather than Commonwealth processes, and frequently attributable to the proponents themselves having failed to produce adequate scientific analysis in their draft EISs. So I think the arguments themselves are on very shaky foundations for this initiative, I think what we can see lying behind all of this is a much wider debate. It's a debate about the future of the energy system in Australia. The chief proponents of the one-stop shop from the industry sector are essentially the fossil fuel industry. And to the extent that they can relieve themselves of the burden of Commonwealth regulation, I think they would understandably expect that they would have a more easy ride at the state level. The one-stop shop has also found willing ears at state government level, as state governments that are cash poor are looking to this type of resource development to shore up their ailing coffers. Even the surviving Labor Premier in Australia from my own state, the Honourable J. Weatherill, has argued that he believes that these measures are necessary to remove unnecessary complexity and duplication in arrangements. And he cited a study of this matter by the Industries Commission that was published late last year in November. It's interesting that study, when you actually look at it closely, contains only a very strongly qualified recommendation to proceed with this one-stop shop procedure. In fact, the Industries Commission said that it would only be desirable if some 5 conditions that they laid out, including strengthening state and territory legislative processes in this area, were undertaken. And it contains the fascinating additional finding that, and I'll quote this, that a targeted approach is likely to lead to the Australian government continuing to control matters where it considers that the community would not accept it exiting the field. And in those cases, the states and territories should accredit Commonwealth processes where the processes address the same matter. I think that's a refreshing perspective. It's in effect a reversal of the current one-stop shop system, one in which it recognises that where there is a community demand for the Commonwealth to remain involved in the evaluation of environmental impacts of certain types of matters, then perhaps the states should concede their jurisdiction to the Commonwealth rather than the other way around. There is a debate also happening in this space around whether the Commonwealth can ensure through these bilateral agreements that the states will maintain the same standards of decision making that currently apply under the Commonwealth legislation. That's in part a legal issue, and one that I think is of sufficient concern to the Commonwealth in terms of its ability to deliver that outcome, that it has prompted the Commonwealth to introduce an amending bill into the Parliament on the coattails of the budget last week, in which it's trying to shore up the legal foundations for its one-stop shop process by amending key provisions in the EPBC Act. Ultimately, though, the principal argument against the one-stop shop and approval bilaterals is that the states themselves are overly influenced by the economic benefits that they perceive will flow from resource development, and that they're not in a position, therefore, to deal objectively with the consideration of these matters of national environmental significance. And there are numerous historical examples in support of this argument. You only have to think back to the Commonwealth intervention to prevent sand mining at Fraser Island, to halt the building of the Franklin River Dam, and more recently the building of the Traveston Crossing Dam in Queensland. It's not that the Commonwealth is always there as a stopper, though. One of the most important functions of this Commonwealth approval process is that by attaching its conditions developed at something more of an arm's length from the relevant industries, it's able to influence outcomes and achieve higher levels of environmental protection than if this task is left simply to the states. There's two other arguments I'll finally put to you in support of my case for not having the one-stop shop process implemented. First, I think if we eliminate the Commonwealth as an honest broker in relation to what are environmentally contentious projects, this will most likely lead, in my opinion, and from long years of experience, to a return to the warfare situation that prevailed at earlier times in our history, in the 70s and 80s, where, in fact, one finds more direct action protests, one finds increased resort to legal proceedings, and now also a new tactical focus on discouraging financial investment in such contentious projects. So rather than streamlining and increasing the efficiency of project assessment and approval in this country, I think there is a very grave risk that this scheme will have an end result of, ironically, of turning out to be the progenitor of more bitter and prolonged disputation over major projects with environmental impacts. The other point I would make is that the so-called one-stop shop will in practice become an eight-stop shop. You count up the states and territories and you'll find we get to 8, in which the detailed procedures and processes in each state and territory will vary considerably despite having been accredited through these approvals bilateral agreements. This is, I think, quite contrary to the fundamental desire that industry regularly expresses to have environmental regulation that is clear and consistent in its outcome, and which gives some sort of degree of certainty to industry in terms of what they can expect in both process and outcomes. The reversion to state-managed EIA processes, I think, will almost certainly give rise to further inconsistencies and uncertainties across the boundaries of each jurisdiction. And then if you connect that up with increased disputation, I think it will ultimately produce the exact opposite to what was intended by the One-Stop Shop initiative. It just may be that behind all of this, it's not just, if you like, a doctrinaire lack of concern on the part of the Commonwealth for environmental protection that is leading it to disengage from these areas. I think it's also, in one sense, partly a cost-shifting exercise by the Commonwealth. It's not even necessarily about red tape reduction. This is reflected in the recent substantial reduction in staffing levels within its own Commonwealth Environment Department. Even before the one-stop shop has been implemented, most of the people who would otherwise be involved in assessing projects for the Commonwealth have already been relieved of their jobs. And the states may find, ultimately, that they have been extremely short-sighted in agreeing to take over these tasks from the Commonwealth when they consider the costs involved. I actually also find it hard to believe that members of the Business Council of Australia, particularly those who are not in the natural resources sector, would not also eventually question why this body has advocated so strongly for this one-stop shop scheme, that will, in the end, deliver less certainty of outcomes than the current system for those businesses. So, in conclusion, where do we go from here? Given the scale of the environmental challenges that are being faced in this country and globally also at the present time, and giving the growing sense of urgency that scientists are communicating to us exists in terms of addressing these problems, I think it is very difficult to understand the rationale for a substantial withdrawal from the field of environmental management by the Commonwealth Government. Rather, and on a constructive note, I'd prefer to see much more work done in the near future on the development of a next generation Commonwealth environmental law that would replace the current EPBC Act, address its inadequacies and set in place measures that would enable the Commonwealth to drive the sustainability agenda in Australia. I can go into a little bit more detail, but I'd rather not at this stage to allow time for Q&A if there is some still, but I can certainly elaborate on what I think that law should do. And I think specifically in the context of environmental assessment, I would propose, as did the Industry Commission, a reversal of the current one-stop shop scheme so that the Commonwealth process would prevail over state environmental assessment processes where it is applied to proposals that involve matters of national environmental significance. Now, I first expressed that view way back in 1999 on the steps of Parliament House, the day the EPBC Act was passed, so at least I can't be accused of being inconsistent in my views. But I do think that every effort should be made to oppose the one-stop shop agenda, and at the same time we should be looking forward to a next generation Commonwealth environmental law that could offer the possibility of truly effective protection for the Australian environment. Thank you.